Okay, so welcome to another lecture on cryptography. I hope you're all back safely from the break after the exercises. Today, we want to talk again about symmetric primitives, but this time we're going to look at a very specific type that is targeted particularly for lightweight applications. And this will, on the one hand, mean lightweight variants of the cryptography we've seen so far, but we will also look at a very different construction method, namely at stream ciphers. So, what's the plan for today? First, I want to talk a bit about what we mean by lightweight. So, the general motivation for this topic, which sort of implementation metrics we usually consider, and what the security requirements are that we have in this context. If you're watching this on YouTube, you may notice that the stream is pretty laggy. So in particular, the video is looking pretty bad. You may want to switch over to the Teams version to have a higher bitrate. I think the PC is a bit overwhelmed with all the things it's supposed to do. Okay, after we look at the motivation for lightweight cryptography, we first look at a number of lightweight design approaches that go in a similar vein as what we've seen so far. So similar to the primitives we saw last week, but more lightweight. And finally, in approximately the second half of the lecture or so, we want to have a look at so-called stream cipher designs. This is because many of the stream cipher design principles, in particular feedback shift registers, can lead to very lightweight designs. And we will see a few constructions for this as well. But before we go into that, I would like to do a little recap quiz about what we already heard last week, since this week's quiz builds pretty much on the previous lecture and covers similar principles. So I'm posting the link for this in the chat as well. You can join here so that you can take part in the quiz. This time you will get points for your answers. You get points for your correct answer, and if you're particularly fast in answering, you get extra points. And at the end, we will have a little evaluation or high score. Okay, I see that many of you are already joining. Let's wait a little bit longer until you've all found it. And in particular, in the meantime, I will also have to find where my window for controlling this thing was. There we are. Okay. So for each question, you will have something between 15 and 25 seconds time, depending on whether there's a lot to read and think or not so much. So don't be surprised if the timing is a bit different. And in particular, if you're on YouTube, be aware that there's a certain lag between what you see on the screen and what you see on your phones. Okay, I guess 22 already looks like a good number that we can start with. So let's have a look at the first quiz question. So which of these is the lowest layer in the cryptography stack of crypto operations? So almost all of you got this easy starting question right. You're right that the primitive is indeed the lowest layer. On top of that, we have schemes, and on top of that, we have protocols. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. So which of these is not a symmetric primitive? Okay, it looked like this was a bit more difficult, but most of you did pick the correct answer, which is trapdoor one-way functions. So while one-way functions sound quite similar to hashes, they do have this trapdoor, which makes them an asymmetric, not a symmetric primitive. Whereas compression functions are a symmetric primitive used in hashing. Permutations are also nice for hashing, and tweakable block ciphers are nice for encryption nodes. Next question. How many keys or permutations are possible to construct if you're looking at n-bit blocks? Here you get a little bit more time to answer. Oh, okay. So most of you probably interpreted this question a bit differently, since most of you answered 2 to the n. So it's true that for most block ciphers in practice, like the AES, we often have a key size that is the same as the block size. And in this case, you can also, so if both the key and the blocks are n bits large, then you have 2 to the n possible keys. However, the question didn't say anything particular about the key size. So what the question said was how many permutations are possible in total. So how many possible instances can a block cipher family have if we don't specify the key size? Simply asking how many different ways are there to construct a permutation of n-bit blocks. And here the correct answer is the second highest one, namely 2 to the n factorial. So if you have 2 to the n possible values of the plaintext and ciphertext, then you can create a lookup table of these, meaning a different permutation, by reordering them. And there are 2 to the n factorial many ways of doing that. So I admit this was a bit of a misleading question. But what it illustrates is that there are there would be way more keys possible than a usual block cipher family actually allows. So the available keys in something like AES are just a tiny fraction of the key size it could have. What does T epsilon security mean? Does it mean that an attack with time t has success probability epsilon, or an attack with t targets succeeds at most epsilon of these targets, or an attack with t time learns at most epsilon bits of the plaintext? Okay, we're back to safer fields now, where most of you can remember this stuff from the previous lecture. So indeed, T epsilon security, that was the picture with these curves. It shows a relation between how much time an attacker invests and what success probability they get as a reward for that. So for example, if they invest 2 to the 128 in a 128-bit block cipher, they get a success probability of 1 usually. Whereas if they invest less, they also get less. Okay, on to the fifth question out of the 7. Which of these is not a design principle for block ciphers? So the majority is right again. The sponge construction is not a design principle for block ciphers. Instead, it is a construction of how you can use permutations to build hash functions, among other things. Whereas the other ones all describe what's going on inside a block cipher. So Feist, as we saw in the exercise as well, substitution permutation network is one of the most widely used constructions, and ARX, add rotate XOR, is more targeted towards software implementations. Almost done. How many rounds does AES need to achieve full diffusion? Okay, very nice collision on the number of correct answers for all the wrong answers, which all got 3 answers. And the correct answer got exactly as many votes as all the other ones combined. So yes, 2 is the correct answer here. After 1 round, if you change 1 bit or 1 byte of the input, it influences only the bits of 4 of the output bytes due to mixed columns. But if you run for another round, then this influence is diffused to the entire state. So after the second round, every bit at the input has influenced in some way every bit of the output. Of course, this also holds for longer rounds, but this is the minimum number of rounds needed for full diffusion. It would be very bad if 10 were the number of required rounds, because 10 is the full number, and if I only achieve full diffusion after the full number of rounds, you can be almost certain that this can be exploited in an attack. Last question. Which of these primitives is available in TLS 1.3? Yeah, most of you correct again. So SHA-2, in particular the SHA-256 version, is indeed available in TLS. Its alternative, which is also standardized by NIST, namely SHA-3, is not yet supported. So not anymore, but not yet. So we will probably have to wait for the next version or so to see that. RC4 was supported for a long time, but has for a long time also been known to have quite a number of weaknesses. So thank goodness it's no longer supported in there. Same for MD5, which has also been known to be broken for quite a while. Okay, thanks everyone for participating. Let's have a quick look at the high score. And, oh, that was a really close race between Lucas and Bran, but apparently Lucas was a tiny bit faster. Congratulations. Okay, then let's head back to the actual lecture and to the question of what lightweight designs are, since this is the main topic for today. So, by lightweight cryptography, we always mean cryptography that is intended for devices which are in some sense constrained. So there are some limits as to what these devices can support. Examples of such constrained devices are, for example, embedded devices, so small microcontrollers that are used, for example, a lot in the Internet of Things, but also even smaller things like RFID tags, which have really, really limited resources, where limited means you don't get many things that you're used to on your PC. On your PC, it's really comfortable. You even have inbuilt instruction sets for example, AES round operations. This is unfortunately not the case everywhere. You also often only have limited space to implement your crypto, and sometimes the power is also a problem. And what's typical of all of these scenarios is that there are some metrics which are very constrained, and you need to do a sort of trade-off to satisfy these limits, but still get a reasonable solution overall. So it's usually the case that some of the characteristics will suffer if you optimize too much in one direction, which might be necessary due to some limitations. So since you all just had your Menti open, maybe one more brainstorming slide at the beginning, namely, what do you think, where where would be places that or application examples that you could imagine for constrained devices? So which scenarios or applications can you come up with where you think lightweight crypto might be useful? Maybe you can also think of specific limitations that I already hinted at the previous slide that could be relevant in the context of lightweight crypto. So a lot of the first few answers mention embedded devices in various spellings. Yeah, so that's definitely a very general category. Some people had more specific suggestions. So what I see here in several places are banking cards or debit and credit cards. Since, as you know, they do have a chip inside, but this is really a tiny chip which doesn't have too much area available and also not too much power. So in particular, it also only works if you actually plug it in. So these are an example, but actually in the last years, these banking cards have developed quite a bit. So they are no longer the most constrained systems we can think of. So as you might know, many of them even run Java. So Java cards are a typical thing. Some people are mentioning car keys. That's a very good example because what car keys have is a very limited battery. So unlike the car, which the banking cards, which only needs to work if you actually plug it in, the car key should always work. So it needs a battery, and it also will have to send signals quite often. So whenever you try to unlock your car or so, you will send quite a few messages. And this shouldn't eat up too much of the battery. It also shouldn't take too long to react, so you don't want to wait for your car to unlock. And on the other hand, this is actually quite a challenging scenario that you have to satisfy there because you try to authenticate and you want to do it in a strong way, so strong authentication, not just telling the car your password or so, because then anyone who listens to the exchange can copy it. Wireless garage door opener falls in essentially the same category. So these are cases where exchanging the batteries is pretty expensive. IoT is mentioned. So IoT, of course, means many things. It can mean many of your home appliances where maybe the power supply is not so difficult. So, for example, you could have, for example, IKEA lamps at home, which can be remote controlled. These are, on the one hand, relatively cheap devices, so they actually don't often have a lot of capabilities. On the other hand, something like power supply is absolutely not a problem because many IoT devices are permanently connected to power and don't need any battery or similar. So IoT sensors and smart home fall in this category. What else do we have here? Someone mentioned caches. So caches are also something you have on your PC that you don't have. So it's actually a very typical thing that you don't have on your constrained devices, which from the cryptography perspective is both a good thing and a bad thing. So actually the cache can make your life quite a bit more difficult as a cryptographer because it can be susceptible to side channel attacks. So having a cache can actually be a problem from a crypto perspective. On the other hand, of course, you can be much more generous. For example, when you process longer messages or so, this is easier when you have, or faster when you have a cache. Encrypted RAM, as mentioned, this is something that needs extremely low latency because if you want to read your data from RAM, you want to have the answers instantly, and you have to do this all the time. So you have to have high throughput and low latency here. What else do we see? So RFID tags, these are particularly critical because they are usually supposed to be extremely cheap. So you can't put a lot of things on there. and they are often passively powered. So you're very constrained in how much power you have available. What else do we see here? Is there anything I didn't read yet? I think I got them all. Okay, thanks a lot for your inputs. Now let's try to bring a bit of structure into this topic. Okay, so I will now list several metrics that we already to some extent heard before, which are typically constrained when we look at lightweight crypto. What I have to say here is that usually not all of these are a problem or are strictly limited, but some of them are particularly strong. And one of the most frequent ones is area. So by area, we mean in some sense the size of the algorithm, which can be either in software, the code size, so the machine code size measured in bytes, or if we look at hardware, if we look at ASICs, it's the size of the circuit. So this is the number of gates, of logic gates that we need to implement the cipher, and is measured in gate equivalents or kilogate equivalents. Or if you look at something some people don't consider hardware, namely at FPGAs, so reprogrammable hardware. In that case, the area is usually measured in the number of lookup tables that you need to implement your cipher, or the number of slices. So when is this area typically limited? The one thing is that many of the devices have a relatively small area available for cryptography, because cryptography was only added as a bit of an afterthought, and the thing already implements some functionality if you think of IoT, and there's just a tiny bit of area left where you can put your crypto. And the reason why there is not more area, because it would be expensive to put more area. So this is usually actually not a really physical limit, but more a financial limit, because putting more gates on it costs more money. Another case, in particular in software, is in particular when you're dealing with older devices or so, they just have a very limited memory for your code. So what can be difficult in particular there is not so much the implementation of the algorithm itself, but the additional storage that you need to store your intermediate results, like your intermediate key schedule values, or storing longer messages before you release them. This can be an actual problem because these things can grow quite large. So what else is there besides area? One thing we already mentioned is energy and power consumption, where energy is what's particularly relevant in battery-powered devices, because there is only a limited supply of energy that you can use up. So you want to have the total energy consumption low, where energy depends on the amount of time your algorithm runs and the peak power that it uses during this time. So in case of battery, both of these factors are important. You want neither individual parts of the cipher that have power spikes, nor do you want the computation to take very long, because that will also increase the total energy that is consumed. In other devices, it's more the power itself that is the problem. This is particularly true in passively powered devices. For example, devices powered in a high frequency or ultra high frequency field, because there the device draws the energy or draws the power from the field it's in, but the more power it needs, the closer it needs to be to the source. So the lower the range of certain wireless transmission setups that you can use. And this, so power is usually measured in watts. Then we come to the question of speed. So speed is usually not so much a focus of lightweight crypto, but it can be. And there are two essential metrics that we care about here. The first one of them is throughput. This is simply the amount of data you can process within a given fixed time. So a metric to evaluate that is typically cycles per byte. So how many CPU cycles, so this is a For example, in the software case, how many CPU cycles do you take for processing 1 byte of data? Of course, this is not just for the single byte from beginning to end, but what the question actually is how many bytes per time period can you process? Now, if you want to optimize throughput, usually what you're talking about is not lightweight crypto, but high performance crypto. It's a bit complicated that both the very limited and the very demanding requirements can sometimes fall into the area of lightweight crypto. Yeah, so it's always just about optimizing one of the possible metrics. So besides throughput, there is one other important speed measurement that we already mentioned, namely the latency. So the difference is the latency describes the delay of the algorithm from the time that you input something to the time that the output signal is available. So it doesn't ask you how many bytes per second can you encrypt, but it asks you, if I give you a plaintext block, how long does it take until you can give me the result? So this is measured in some time units such as cycles or seconds. And there is very often a trade-off that you can make here. So typically if you think of, for example, AES, if you think of an AES round and you have these S boxes in there, and you have to execute these 16 S boxes. Now you can choose to implement that either in a way that you implement the S box just once and execute one of the bytes after the other, or you can choose to execute the 16 bytes in parallel. So in hardware, you can choose that. So often you have a choice between taking more area and then being faster, or taking less area and then being slower. And different cipher designs are a bit more suited toward the one or the other approach, but most of them are actually quite flexible. So here it's often not so much, or not only the cipher that needs to be lightweight, but you also need to implement for the specific metric that you like. So besides the limits that you have, there are of course also some things you want to achieve. So in particular, there are some security goals that you still want to achieve. So there was a question, namely whether there isn't a connection between latency and throughput. Well, there is a connection, but it's not an immediate connection. So if you think of, let's for example say that the latency of my very, very slow cipher is 1 second. So I give it the input and then it takes 1 second and then it gives me the output. This doesn't immediately tell me what the throughput of this cipher is. Because what it doesn't answer is, when I now want to encrypt multiple plain texts, can I somehow pipeline this? So if the first processed output block takes 1 second, will the next block be ready after 1.1 seconds, or will it take 2 seconds? And so in block ciphers, it's a bit artificial, but if you look at actual encryption schemes or hashing schemes, then you see that a low latency absolutely does not guarantee a high throughput. So for high throughput, it can sometimes be very beneficial if you process your data in very large blocks. So for example, if you think of the Ketchuk hash function, it can have a very high rate of something like 500 to 1000 bits or so. So it processes the data in very large blocks, which means that for every execution of the cipher, a lot of data is processed, meaning it can generate a high throughput. But it does not necessarily have a low latency. So for latency, it would be better to process the data in smaller chunks and then take less time per chunk. So optimizing for latency is typically small blocks that you process to have a quick answer ready for the first few bits, but then the next few take a while. Whereas for high throughput, you often want to operate on large chunks, even if these large chunks take a bit longer to process than the smaller ones would. But then you get a lot of result at once. So Thanks also to nBrother for the for the extra visual explanation with the water hose. Okay, so back to security. One of the things that is, of course, immediately linked with security is the key size that you support. And when you suggest to make something lightweight, very often the first association that people have is, okay, let's make the key a bit smaller. And while it's true that most keys have a relatively small key size, most lightweight ciphers have a relatively small key size, up to 128 bits, this is actually not a clear distinction between lightweight and non-lightweight, because having slightly larger keys often doesn't cost that much. Still, classically, many lightweight ciphers try to be very stingy on this, not so much because having a slightly larger key costs so much, but because providing the higher security level costs a lot. Because if you have a larger key, you also want a higher security level, meaning you, for example, often have to do more rounds of the block cipher or so. And you will find quite a number of lightweight ciphers with very small key sizes. For example, one very well-known one that we already saw last week is Present, which only has 80-bit keys. There are even ciphers that you find today that only have 64-bit keys, like, for example, some variants of Simon and Speck. These are two lightweight block ciphers published by the NSA. And some people think this is okay because they think of scenarios where data is only valuable for a very short time. So more expensive attacks are outside the security scenario. However, there is currently an ongoing standardization process for lightweight crypto, and their NIST said very clearly that they do want key sizes of 128 bits. They're even okay with larger keys. And it's acceptable if the security level is a tiny bit below the key size, but it should also be at least 112 bits. So NIST does not consider smaller key sizes acceptable even for lightweight ciphers. So there's actually not that much of a compromise to be made in terms of key sizes. Another thing that impacts the cost of implementations quite a bit is the block size of ciphers. Because having larger blocks is on the one hand expensive because you always need to have this larger chunk of writable area that you refresh all the time. So you need the corresponding flip-flops in the hardware case or the corresponding variables and words in the CPU case. And on the other hand, having a larger block also means more work to actually process this block. So to, for example, to achieve full diffusion in properties like this, because the more bits you need to diffuse to, the more it costs. So larger ciphers tend to have a higher number of rounds, for example, which makes them slower as well as having a higher area. So typical, if you look at the lightweight research of the last 15 years or so, you find quite a lot of lightweight block cipher designs, and most of them have something like 64-bit states. Some have 128-bit states. And where this can become an issue is if you then want to use the cipher to process a lot of data, because then you run into effects of the birthday paradox. We will discuss this for some specific modes in one of the mode lectures in a few weeks. So block size is also something where compromising can give you a benefit, but you have to be very careful that you don't overdo it. But overall, you already notice that there isn't actually too much wriggling field or so when adapting the interface parameters. Then, besides the actual parameters, there's of course the question what protection against attacks you actually expect. So one thing that many lightweight ciphers try to gain is by having a smaller security margin. So the security margin means if you have a block cipher with a certain number of rounds and cryptanalysts try to break round-reduced versions, if they, for example, only find attacks that cover up to 60% of the rounds, so which would only work if the cipher had, for example, 40% fewer rounds. Then this is a relatively generous security margin. And lightweight ciphers, in particular those that aim for low latency, often try to win a bit by making a smaller security margin, which means that the risk that some of the attacks will be improved to actually cover the full cipher is higher. So being riskier is often something that lightweight ciphers do. Yeah, and this is because having more rounds costs in energy and costs in latency. Okay. There is also one other consideration that often pops up in this context, and that is to what extent do you want to protect against other attacks that are not the simple, straightforward cryptanalytic attacks. Such other attacks are on the one hand things like misuse attacks, for example, nonce misuse, and which means repeating the nonce even though you shouldn't. And on the other hand, it's things like implementation attacks, such as fault attacks and side channel attacks, which you have which you are threatened by whenever you expose your devices to a physical attacker, which unfortunately happens quite often for the sort of applications we discussed earlier. So, for example, if you're using your car key, it's actually not so unlikely that somebody is nearby and is able to measure, well, it's a bit unlikely maybe, but to measure something like the electromagnetic radiation from the key. Or if you think of many of the smart home appliances, the secret communication is actually often between the smart home appliance and the company that owns or that sold the device. So in this sense, the user can sometimes be seen as an attacker in this scenario, who, for example, tries to reverse engineer some algorithm that is going on in the device, or who is trying to trick the device into offering, for example, some service that would otherwise be locked because the customer would have to pay for it or something like that. So digital rights management or things like that are cases where the person who possesses the device is actually considered the adversary, because actually the device is secretly trying to communicate with, for example, a company or so in the background. And there are a number of things to take into account when you want to protect against such scenarios. One of the things, if you're looking at the CPU context, is that you want, for example, to avoid lookup tables like in S-boxes, because the timing of these table lookups can be exploited in cache attacks. So one thing that often helps against this is to consider a different implementation strategy for S-boxes. So to implement the S-box not as a lookup table, but as a bitwise circuit. And this is called bit-sliced implementation. And this works particularly well if the S-box, for example, can be described by a simple circuit, whereas it's difficult if the circuit is very complex, needs many operations, and so on. So AES, for example, is a relatively complex circuit. Another thing where these bit-sliced implementations are relevant is if you try to protect against other sorts of side channels, such as power analysis attacks. Because one of the main defense strategies against such attacks is masking. And for this, you need to mask this S-box circuit, and the fewer gates it has, specifically the fewer nonlinear gates it has, the cheaper this is. But on the other hand, to be honest, in many lightweight scenarios, even though it would make sense from an application security perspective to protect against side channel attacks, this is just something that producers don't want to do because it would mean extra cost, because it would mean a higher area, it would mean a lower battery life, and similar. So this is something where implementations often compromise. So to to say a few more words about this masking approach, which you hear about more in other lectures. So this is a countermeasure that protects against side-channel attacks where the adversary tries to measure the power consumption of the device while processing the secret key and tries to infer some information. And the trick, or why it works, is because some of the gates will process some secret bits, such as the key, and there the power consumption of these gates varies depending on the value of the key bit. And to hide this, one strategy is masking. And the idea of masking is that you take each bit, each variable that you have inside the cipher, and split it into several shares, such that each of the individual shares looks random, but the sum of all shares is the correct value. And since the individual bits look random, their power consumption will no longer leak any information. So this works well, but it has some limitations that make it more costly in side-channel attacks, unless you really prepare your cipher for it. And one of the reasons is that for this masking, since the individual bits are supposed to look random, you need a randomness source, which is often hard to get. So in particular, a fast randomness source is often hard to get on constrained devices. You do have a certain area overhead because you duplicate each of the bits. So of course, you also duplicate your area requirements. And how much this duplication takes place depends, or how much the overhead is, depends particular on the number of nonlinear operations you have in your cipher. Okay, so let's have a look at a few examples that try to address all of these many requirements or half requirements that I tried to sketch in the last few minutes. And for this, I first want to have a look at how suitable particular types of operations are for particular platforms. And let's first have a look at hardware implementations, meaning implementations where you really take the cipher, write it down as a circuit of logical gates, and implement these logical gates in hardware. So what works particularly well there? One thing that's super cheap and costs essentially nothing is exchanging the position of bytes. So something like bit permutations. We saw an example for this last week, and I'll also show it again in a moment. Because this is simply a rewiring of the circuitry. It needs no gates. It needs, well, nothing essentially. It also doesn't really cost anything in terms of masking. What's also good is if you have a cipher which has a simple description in gates, and in particular, if this description has relatively few AND gates and more XOR gates. Whenever I say AND gates, I mean any nonlinear gates, so AND or NAND or 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 anything like that. What's also suitable for hardware or often desirable is that you have a smaller state size. So for example, a 64-bit block cipher needs a lot less area than a 128-bit block cipher. Things that do not work as well in hardware are things that are available on a CPU, but take a bit to implement in hardware. This includes certain word operations, like for example, integer multiplication. It's a horror. Or integer addition. So while integer addition is okay-ish, you always have this carry bit that you have to drag on from one bit position to the next, which is relatively expensive. Other things that don't work so well are whatever you call heavy mathematical operations. So for example, operations in a finite field, like MDS matrix is okay if it looks like the one in AES, but it's not okay if it has very high, or it's not great if it has very complicated coefficients. And finally, what absolutely doesn't work well is lookup tables like S-boxes, unless they can be rewritten as a simple circuit. What also doesn't work well, although it's not listed here, is things like data-dependent movements. So if you, for example, know what the RC4 stream cipher looked like, it had some rules like look up the value in this byte and then take this as the new index to move this other byte to. So data-dependent rerouting. This is pretty expensive, and it's not the same as the bit permutations I mentioned here in the first point, because bit permutation means a predefined static redistribution, which can be statically done by rewiring. So what about software? Of course, the by far easiest thing to do in software, if it's possible, is to use available cryptographic instructions, because this is quite obviously the cheapest thing to do. So for example, if you are on a CPU which has AES instructions, then using these instructions is pretty surely more clever than implementing your own circuit using other operations. So what are other operations that you can still use very well? Well, anything that the CPU provides. So doing things like XOR and rotations works nice. Arithmetic modulo n, so things like integer additions, works reasonably well as well. So you have the ready-made instructions. And what also works well is anything that you can parallelize nicely. So where you can really take advantage of your CPU pipeline and do multiple things in parallel without always having to wait for the result of the previous computation. This parallelizability is both important if you look inside the primitive. So for example, being able to do many S boxes in parallel also is nice, but also on the mode level. So for example, if you think of the counter mode, where you also need to do many AES computations, but they don't depend on each other, so you can just start doing them all at the same time. That's nice. What does not work so well in software? Well, actually, one of the things that is quite popular in old lightweight ciphers, namely single bit operations, like taking the bits of a word and rewiring them in some predefined way within a word. This is really painful because to implement this, you either need to change the state layout completely, or you need to do things like mask out all the individual bits, then shift or rotate them around, then XOR it together again, and then do this for each of the bit positions in the word, which would mean many, many instructions for just operating on one word. So this is not a good idea. In general, things that don't take advantage of the word size of the CPU don't take advantage of everything there is, and are thus less efficient than they could be. Another thing that can be implemented easily but can lead to problems is lookup tables. So for example, an AES implementation based on lookup tables, where you implement the S-box and maybe even the mixed column step using a lookup table, are well, not inefficient, but potentially dangerous, susceptible to side channel attacks. Okay, I guess it's time to look at some specific designs and some examples. And actually, we've already seen quite a few designs which are at least not hopelessly bad. So in particular, the AES design is actually surprisingly good and can be done reasonably well in both software and hardware. This was actually one of the, also among the design criteria. So being lightweight was definitely not among the design criteria, and there are a few things that are not great. So for example, the relatively large S-box, the 8-bit S-box, is a bit of a problem. It even more so if you want to do masking or things like that. However, many lightweight ciphers of the past years have just taken the AES approach and tried to make some individual steps more lightweight. And one of the chief things to do there is to have a smaller S-box. So to use, for example, 4-bit S-boxes instead of 8-bit S-boxes, because this is easier to do in hardware and also easier to mask. You can also try to do things like a cheaper mixed columns implementation or definition, which has, for example, more zero entries in the matrix so that it doesn't have the fully blown matrix operation. Or it can be a matrix that you don't just write down with many big coefficients, but this matrix could be the power of some simpler matrix, which only has a few non-zero entries. And if you execute this several times, you get the big matrix. This is a strategy that sometimes works if you have very low area requirements. And there are many ciphers that go in this direction. I've listed a few here. So LED is one of these cases, Midori as well. So Midori is particularly aimed for low energy. So it tries to both have a relatively low number of rounds, but also to make the individual round operations a bit cheaper than AES. And Skinny is a more recent example that is currently also under consideration in the standardization approach. However, so far we've talked a lot about block ciphers. First, let's show again present, which we already saw last week, because it's a very prototypical example of something that's cheap in hardware. So if you remember, present was a block cipher we saw last week with 64-bit blocks, and it also supports relatively small keys. And the design is actually really simple. So it just consists of round key addition, 4-bit S boxes, and then some bit permutations. So in hardware, this is really cheap to do, assuming that the circuit that describes this S box here is relatively simple. What you also see here is that the cost for this compared to AES is a much larger number of rounds and actually also a smaller security margin. So these operations here are very simple, a lot simpler than, for example, mixed columns and sub-bytes, but they also take longer to really be effective. How we measure this effectiveness, by the way, is something we will revisit next week as well. So how to measure when the number of rounds is enough. Anyway, what I was trying to say is we've talked a lot about certain block ciphers. However, one must ask at this point whether the block cipher is really the ideal building block if you try to build something, some lightweight scheme. And as an example here, I'm listing two approaches, one based on block ciphers and one based on permutations for hashing. So if you remember the constructions we saw for hashing in the exercises today and also in the lecture, they look something like this. They take a block cipher where the size of the block cipher must be large enough for hash purposes. So for example, it must be 256-bit at least. And then they plug the chaining value and the message block as key and message into the cipher. Now, of course, the area requirements that you have definitely include whatever is going on inside this block cipher here. But they also include, if you look, for example, at this Davis-Meyer construction here, something to make the function hard to invert, which can, for example, be this feed forward we already saw. But for this feed forward, what this means is that you need to keep a copy of the input state throughout the entire processing of the cipher. So in addition to the 256-bit inside the cipher, you also have to keep 256-bit of the chaining value to be able to edit at the end. And in addition to all that, you also need to use the message as a key here, which means you need to have a certain key schedule. Now, in order for this to be secure, the key should of course be at least 128 bits. But this also means that the key schedule at any time must keep track of 128 bits. So in total, you will have, independent of what the cipher looks like inside, you will have to always keep track of something like 512 plus 128, so 640 bits in total, to be able to use a block cipher for hashing, for example. And actually, this can be done a lot cheaper when you use different building blocks. And one of these approaches is the sponge construction that was introduced with SHA-3, with the SHA-3 hash function. Now, SHA-3 is absolutely not lightweight. It has a huge state of 1,600 bits, so it's definitely very, very large. It has a very high throughput. However, this approach can be scaled down quite a bit. So this is because the requirements for the state sizes are only the following. So how this works is to absorb each message block, you simply XOR it to a part of the chaining value. You apply the permutation and then go on to the next message block. And at the end, you truncate a part of this state to make it non-invertible. So instead of a feed-forward, you use truncation for non-invertibility. Now, how large does this state have to be? Of course, the state here needs to be at least 256 bits large to protect against collisions. More specifically, this inner part of the state needs to be at least 256. But the good news is that the part where you XOR the message in can be as small as you like, essentially. So, for example, if you would like, you could just have the 1-bit outer part here. Of course, this would lead to a cipher with a very high latency and a very low throughput, but with a potentially very low area. So this needs only something like 40% of the state size of this one here as a minimum. Of course, you can always make it a bit larger to have a somewhat higher throughput here, but overall you can see that this is a lot smaller than the block cipher approach. So looking at other primitives becomes even more important if you try to do lightweight crypto. Tweakable block ciphers are another example of a building block that is not so well suited for hashing, but for encrypting it can be a good alternative. In particular, if you want to achieve something like low latency, then a tweakable block cipher can actually be pretty good. Okay, so maybe permutations are an attractive alternative in the lightweight use case. And this is also something that we can see in this standardization process that I was mentioning. This is a process similar to the AES competition, which started last year in 2019 and is again organized by NIST. And the goal of this competition now is to specifically find a lightweight cipher, where cipher means on the one hand they are looking for an authenticated encryption scheme, and on the other hand, if possible, also a hash function that is more lightweight than the current versions, because actually the current NIST standardized hash functions are both very, very far away from lightweight. Both are more tuned for large throughput. So this started last year, and they received quite a bit more submissions than the AES competition, namely a total of 56 different ciphers in the first round. Now these have already been narrowed down also at the end of last year to 32 round 2 candidates, and we're expecting another reduction to something like maybe 8 ciphers or so to happen later this year, so probably in December. Actually, there's a conference related to this competition that starts next week, where we'll discuss the current candidates that are competing there. And 2 of the candidates that are competing there are co-designed by people from IAK. In particular, that's the ASCON cipher and the ISAP cipher. So both of these are authenticated encryption schemes, and both of them can also reuse the internal primitives to build a very lightweight hash function. And what we're hoping is, of course, that both of them will be selected for the next round. We will see about that. ASCON probably has pretty good chances because it was already selected as the winner in the lightweight category in a previous competition. That was not an official standardization call, but a competition for authenticated encryption, namely the CISA competition. So compared to many of the other candidates, ASCON has been analyzed quite a bit more and is also more efficient than many of the others, in particular when we're talking about sidechain attacks. So what we're hoping is for a decision on this process sometime next year, and I guess the standards will take a few more years after that. So let's have a look at the internal primitive of ASCON. I'm not going to explain the mode, but let's just have a look at the primitive inside and to which of the previous requirements it caters to. So it actually only has 2 round operations, so it's also relatively simple. It has an SBox layer and a linear layer, like some of the other schemes we saw. What's a bit untypical about the SBox layer is that it has a 5-bit SBox, and that this SBox is never intended to be implemented as a lookup table, but it's directly given as a circuit to implement. And the circuit looks as follows. So these O pluses here denote XORs, the O dots denote multiplications, and the O minuses denote flipping the bits, so a negation. Now what's going on inside this thing? In the middle here, you see a core that you might actually remember from last week. So this is the same SBox core that SHA-3 uses as well. And why did we use it in ASCON? Well, you can see that it has very few AND gates, so only 5 of them. And also very few other operations, and it's quite regular in structure, which means it's relatively easy to describe some properties it has and to analyze it in cryptanalysis. But you see that this is not the only thing that happens inside, but some additional operations are done before and afterwards. Now these operations don't cost a lot because, for example, they don't include AND gates. So in particular, this SBox is, for example, very cheap to mask because you only have these 5 AND gates. But what these XORs and this one negation do is improve the cryptanalytic properties, such as if you tweak 1 bit at the input here, how many of the output bits are at least changed. And to generally improve the diffusion between the different words here. So the state layout here, in case you haven't figured it out yet, this consists of 64-bit words, which we chose so that it's also well implementable on a CPU, not only in hardware. And we have 5 of those words, which are labeled X1 to X5. So if you implement this SBox in hardware, you would have the circuit here so either 1 time or 64 times, or however you want to balance your area with your throughput. Whereas if you implement it in software, you can simply use exactly these CPU instructions and always apply them to the full 64 bits at once. So the number of CPU instructions that you need to implement this SBox for the entire state, so all 64 SBoxes in parallel, is just the number of gates you see here, because you simply apply all these operations word-wise. And this is done to provide diffusion between the words and to introduce the nonlinear part here. And the linear layer is now responsible for the diffusion across, so within the words. So it's an operation that is applied to each word separately. And actually for each word we have a slightly different definition, which has the same format, but some different constant offsets. So what this does is it takes the word it has, makes 2 copies of it, and shifts these copies by different amounts, and then XORs all the results together. And by shifting, I mean cyclic shift. So it rotates the copies of the words and then XORs everything together. So this is easy to write down if you're implementing it for the CPU, because you just write down essentially this. And if you do it in hardware, well, you only need to implement the XORs. So you need to implement 2 XORs per bit of the state. Okay, so these are the only 2 operations. You see that this is fewer than, for example, in the AES. And this is because we don't have this sort of 3-dimensional structure of AES, which has rows and columns and multi-bit words in each of these cells, but we compress it down to only 2 dimensions to make it easier to describe, easier to analyze, and of course more efficient, to not have any unnecessary steps in there. Okay, so this is a sort of alternative approach which tries to balance hardware and software, and also be suited, for example, for masking. Okay, that's it for the standard design, so to say. And now at the end, in the last third or so of the lecture, I still want to have a look at a rather different approach, namely at stream ciphers, which internally use quite different operations. So what's the motivation or the idea behind this this construction? The inspiration is essentially the most lightweight cipher you can think of, which is the Vernam scheme or one-time pad that we talked about in the first lecture, which, if you remember, worked as follows. You simply choose a key which is fresh, random, and at least as long as the plaintext, and then you XOR it to the plaintext, and that's it. So the good news is, from a lightweight perspective, it has perfect secrecy, and it's as cheap as it gets. So the only thing you do is one XOR per bit of the plaintext. So that's great, but of course it comes with a big downside, namely that it's usually not practical to generate such a key, to distribute such a key, and to keep it secure. And also you cannot extend this in any way to provide authenticity. So some good things, but some rather bad things. And what stream ciphers try to do is they try to make a practical implementation of this approach. So the goal is to not have one huge key, but to have only a small key and to use a random number generator essentially to expand this short key or short seed to a long string of random looking key material, the key stream. And the original small key, so the seed, should still be large enough that brute force isn't possible. And the function that expands should, of course, be secure in some sense. So in particular, it shouldn't allow to find things like patterns in the produced key stream or to predict the key stream. And because these stream ciphers very often operate by producing this key stream bit by bit in some very cheap operations, they can often be very efficient in hardware, in particular in terms of area. So the general model is the following. You replace your one big key by such a scheme which you initialize with your initial seed. Then you have some function which updates the state, where the state initially contains the key. And it can actually also be that the update function also depends on the key in some cases. Usually this is not the case, but it can be. So you do this as often as necessary, and whenever you want to encrypt a portion of the plaintext, you extract some of the current state by using a filter output, so which of course doesn't give out the entire state, but just some function of it, so that you cannot recover the state and continue looping. You need to select some of the bits, maybe compress this information a bit so that it's definitely not reversible, and then XOR this to the plaintext. So the XOR remains like before, but the way the key is generated is now pseudo-random instead of truly random. And the recipient runs the exact same machine, produces the exact same key stream, and XORs it to the key. And so the key could theoretically influence the initial state, the update function, and the filter function. But most often it's just fed into the state once at the beginning, and the rest is public. What we need in addition to what I've shown on the previous picture is something to make sure that we never generate the same key stream twice. Because you already know this problem from last week's exercise tasks. If you have a one-time pad and you repeat the key stream, you're dead. And the same thing holds for stream ciphers. So if you manage to produce the same key stream twice, you lose security. So what we need is a value to make sure that this key stream never repeats. So we need an additional random value as an input. And this plays more or less exactly the same role as the non-stars in normal encryption schemes. Here it's often called initial value, but it's the same thing. It's a value that never repeats and that influences the key stream. So what you usually do is this initialization step means you first fill your state in some way with the key, and at the same time or afterwards with the IV. So once in the beginning, then you always run your update function and produce the key stream from it. So the key stream then depends on the IV as well as the key and how much key stream has already been generated. And what's typical in stream ciphers is that the setup can be quite costly because they often have a not so tiny state which first needs to be filled in a way that you can't compute backwards to the key in case you learn the state. But once this state is pre-initialized, the actual stream production is pretty fast. So what do we want the stream to look like? Of course, it should be efficient. After all, we're talking about lightweight crypto. It should also look random in the sense that there shouldn't be a bias in the output. So for example, if your key stream has 75% zeros and only 25% ones, then an attacker can always learn a bit about the message by guessing that the current key stream bit is 0 and looking what this says about the message. And what they guess will be correct more often than wrong. So they will potentially learn some parts of the plain text, or at least be able to say which plain text is more likely than another plain text. So it should be it should look evenly distributed. It should also usually be unpredictable. So if you have already produced a bit of key stream and you now want to encrypt the next block for an adversary, it shouldn't. For example, if the adversary knew a bit of the plain text, so they could recover a bit of the key stream, they shouldn't then be able to predict what the next key stream parts look like. Because in that case, a partially known plain text could be used in order to recover the full plain text. That would be bad. And finally, if the attacker learns the key stream in some way, for example, because they know a bit of the plain text, then it should be hard to compute back from this key stream to the key, or to find any correlation or connection between this key stream and the input key. Because the input key lives longer than the current key stream, it will be used with other initial values in the future. So if we learn that, we have a problem. And one of the most widely used building blocks that are then used for this update function inside are so-called linear feedback shift registers, or LFSRs. So what's an LFSR? It's a shift register where the next bit is a linear function of the previous state. So that's maybe a bit hard to digest. I have a nice picture on the next slide, but for now let's have a look at the formula. So the idea is that you have a current state, which is L bits long. So we can label it xn up to Sn plus L, minus 1. So that's the state x. And then we shift this state by 1 bit. So 1 bit is kicked out, or the others move 1 position, and the new bit is filled with a linear function of all the other bits, including the one that was just kicked out. And this is a very simple structure. It's a linear structure, and it has been extremely popular for an extremely long time. So in particular in military encryption scenarios, but also in communication security, for example, related to cell phone security. So the encryption that protects your H connection or your 3G connection or so to the mobile post. This has all been classically done with stream ciphers. And this is because they are very fast in hardware and relatively cheap to implement. The downside is that in software, they are typically pretty painful, so unnecessarily slow. And we will also see that they very often come with some security issues. But let's first have a look at a pretty picture. So that's what an LFSR looks like. We see the current state on the bottom here. So all these are flip-flops or cells which hold the current state. Each of these is usually 1 bit. In theory, we could also do it with other sizes, like byte-wise or so, but typically this is done bitwise. And whenever the clock is triggered, one of the state bits is kicked out. And before it's gone, we compute this linear function of all the current state bits, which takes those states where the constant is 1. So all these C's are either 1 or 0. If it's 1, we take the current bit. If it's 0, we don't take it. And then we XOR these selected bits together, fill it into the newest field, and shift all the rest by 1. And we can describe this as on the previous slide with this linear recursion function. There are also different representations. For example, you will sometimes encounter a representation called the connection polynomial, which looks a bit similar to this, but is a bit harder to understand. And the idea here is that the bit that is kicked out is not actually lost, but this is used as the key stream. So I always give up 1 bit of the state to the outside and then update the rest of the state. So as an example, if we take this previous 5-bit LFSR and we say that 2 of the constants are 1, meaning that every new bit is the XOR of 2 of the current bits. And we fill this current state with some starting state, which will typically be the key. Then we can produce the next bits as given by this rule. So for example, xn plus 5, so the next one here is supposed to be xn, which is this one here, plus xn plus 2, which is this one here, so 0 plus 0 equals 0. And the next one is 1 plus 0 equals 1, and so on and so on. So you always use this simple linear recursion to compute the next bit. And one thing to notice here is that the output that we produce always mirrors the previous state of the register. So, for example, if we look at the starting state, then the first 5 bits I give out are actually the first 5 bits that I had in the initial state in here. So I'm sort of publishing my entire state over time, and I'm also overwriting it with other values. But what this also means is that whenever I get to the same initial state again, then from there on, all my output stream will be repeating. So it's periodic. And in the present example, this period is 31. So after outputting 31 bits, I will start producing the same bits again that I had in the very beginning. So what's good and what's bad about this construction? What's good is that the output passes many tests for pseudo-randomness. And one of the reasons for why this is that it can have relatively large so-called periods. So like we saw in the previous slide, the period says when the key stream starts repeating. And under some conditions for the specific shape of the LFSR, which is related to this connection polynomial. So in other words, it depends on the coefficient C. So under some conditions for these constants, we know that the LFSR has the maximum possible period. Every non-zero initial state has the maximum period. Of course, the 0 initial state is pretty boring in LFSR, because if all the initial bits are 0, every bit produced afterwards is the XOR of some zeros and will also be 0. So the all-0 state or the all-0 initial state is not usable in LFSRs, but any other initial state will have the maximum period, which in other words means, since this maximum period is 2 to the L minus 1, where L is the size, this means that of all the 2 to the L possible values that the state can take, every value except 0 occurs at some point before the key stream starts repeating. And this is essentially the best I can do with this size. And this can be, if the length is reasonably large, then this period will also be very large. So the pseudo-random test will not see that the parts actually repeat, because the period is so large that the test never gets to the point where it starts repeating. So that's the good part. It looks very well distributed. There is no bias in the output under some conditions for the connection polynomial. And except for the fact that you never get the all zero output. But it also has some downsides. So first, it's not unpredictable. If you ever know L bits of the state of the output, then you know the state it had at some point and can just continue computing from there. At least in the scenario where the coefficients are public. There have also been some designs where the coefficients are kept secret, but there are also algorithms then to determine these coefficients given enough data. So it's not unpredictable, and of course what I've not even written here, this is a completely linear function. So whenever I learn a certain amount of information about the output, I can recover all the rest with linear equation solving. So this is of course a big problem, and it means that I cannot directly use this building block in a cipher. Now one could of course say, okay, the problem is it's linear, let's just make it nonlinear by adding an and somewhere. The problem is that nonlinear feedback shift registers are a lot harder to analyze mathematically than LFSRs. So in particular, it's for example harder to predict the period and so on of these designs. But still, we need some sort of mechanism to be able to use these LFSRs to build something secure. And some of these examples include that I can have multiple LFSRs and output not the key stream itself, but a nonlinear function of these individual output streams. I have a picture in a moment. You can also use other forms of nonlinear filtering, or, as I said, it's a bit difficult, but you can also use nonlinear feedback shift registers. However, the designs based on LFSRs are still among the most popular. So, in particular, as I mentioned, when we're protecting data connection links such as GSM or UMTS, or also Bluetooth connections, these stream ciphers have traditionally been very popular. So A51 or E0 are examples of such stream ciphers. Another one that I mentioned here is Acorn. This is a much newer design, and I'm mentioning it because in the CESA competition, which I talked about earlier briefly, where Ascon was selected as the first choice for lightweight crypto, Acorn is an LFSR-based scheme that was selected as the second choice, or second recommendation for lightweight crypto, so second place. As far as I know, it's not used anywhere yet, because it's still relatively new, but we do hope that more secure, newer designs will replace these old ones as soon as possible, because there are a lot of weaknesses known of these stream ciphers, like for example E0. So for example, E0, even though it has a 128-bit key, it only provides something like 64-bit security. So these are still widely used, but I really wouldn't recommend building your own system on them, because they're often old, dated, have known weaknesses, but still haven't been replaced. Let's again look at a few pictures, first of a very generic construction about how such a nonlinear combination could look like. And this is relevant because you will have this sort of construction in the exercises. So the idea with nonlinear combination is you have several LFSRs. They may have different lengths actually. And then to produce the key stream output, you take the bits produced by the individual LFSRs and put them into some nonlinear function. One example could be that you AND them together. Now, ANDing them is by itself not a very good idea, because if you take the AND of two uniformly distributed input bits, the output will be 0 with a probability of 3/4. So you have a bias in your key stream. So AND is maybe not the best idea. You need something a bit more complex. And what you will see in the exercises is how you can exploit particular properties of a nonlinear combiner. So for example, in some cases, if you learn a bit about the output, you may be able to infer something about the inputs. So for example, if this were an AND, and you observe that there is a 1 at the output, then you would immediately know that both of the inputs were also 1. And with this, you can partially learn some information about the output of the LFSRs. And since we said that LFSRs are linear functions, you can combine this knowledge, this selected knowledge, and put the puzzle pieces together until you can recover the full state of the LFSR. So that's the idea of one of the exercise tasks. Okay, what other constructions do we have? One is called clock control. So instead of ANDing the LFSR outputs together, you can also do things like you could use the output of one LFSR, which is connected to a regular clock, to decide which of two other LFSRs you want to clock next. So if the bit is 1, then you step forward one position and take the output bit of LFSR 2 for the output. And if the bit is 0, you instead clock LFSR number 3 and take the output bit of that LFSR for the output. And otherwise, the one that is not clocked, you will repeat the previous value. That's the idea in this construction here. So one LFSR controls which of the other two LFSRs advances, and then you XOR the new bit of the advanced one and the old bit of the non-advanced one, and this gives you the output. And now I have two pictures of stream ciphers which are not based on LFSRs. The first one of them is called Trivium. It was also one of the final portfolio entries of a previous competition, the so-called eStream project, which looked for stream ciphers. Now, unfortunately, in the original portfolio, many of the schemes that were selected were later broken. This confirms a bit this prejudice that stream ciphers are really hard to get secure. So what does Trivium look like? It doesn't have LFSRs inside, but it has NFSRs, so nonlinear feedback shift registers. And what you see here is a graphically very attractive, but not really easy to read representation. So what you see here is these chunks here in this ring, like for example S178 to S4 243. These are parts of the shift register. So these are bits 178 to 243 of my feedback shift register. And then what you see here below and above is at which places, at which bit positions you tap the LFSR, like in the LFSR case, you take the bit and XOR it to some other position. So this is like a very lightweight LFSR where you XOR only very few positions. And it's not only purely linear, but you see that in some places you also take the AND of several of the bits and XOR them together with some other values from here and XOR them here and so on. And you can think of it as a cyclic thing that runs in circles. So it's clocked in this direction. The bits always move to the next position, and whenever it goes to such a tap, it's also XORed in another position. And what you see here in the middle is what's used as an output. So to produce the output bit, Trivium simply takes 3 specific bit positions that are produced by this shift register, XORs them, and that's it. So it's like a bit of a more messy and more non-linear version of an LFSR. And to get going in the very beginning, we initialize this ring here with the key value and the IV and some constants. We need the constants because the combined key and IV are only 160 bits, but the state is 288 bits. You will see that in stream ciphers, you essentially always have that the state size is at least twice the security level and often even more than that. This is because of some generic attacks that could otherwise be performed. So in the beginning, you write the key and IV in there, and to avoid directly outputting the key in the beginning, what you first do is you first clock this thing for 1,152 rounds. Now, that sounds like extremely much. It also does take a while. However, you have to take into account that this is a state of 288 bits, and you only update 1 or 2 or 3 bits by clocking it once. So by clocking it 288 times, you only turn it once in a circle. So it's only turned 4 times in a circle before starting to produce output. And for the output production, we use then exactly this construction here, and just clock it forward once, produce 1 bit, XOR it to the plaintext, and so on. So that's an example of a real-world NFSR stream cipher. Now for a very different stream cipher design, which is absolutely not targeted at hardware, but at software. This no longer has anything to do with LFSRs, but it's a different kind of stream cipher design. So this is Cha-Cha-20, which is actually also available in TLS, even in version 1.3. And it's the only alternative besides AES that you can choose for encryption, actually. So what does it look like? It's tailored for software. So instead of a bitwise representation, we have a wordwise representation. And the state consists of 32-bit words. In total, there are 16 such words. So the state size is 512 bits. And in the beginning, what you write into these many bits is, again, the key, some constant, the nonce, and a counter. Because one of the big differences between this design and the previous ones is that you don't just keep updating your state and always produce new stuff. What you instead do is it's a bit similar to the counter encryption mode. You take your update operation, and you, as an input, you additionally add a current block counter. You apply the function, and then you use a feed forward to make this non-invertible, and you take the result and XOR it to the plaintext. So you don't really produce a stream, but you do produce these blockwise outputs. So it does look quite a bit like counter mode encryption, actually. But it's a streaming mode in the sense that you produce a key stream that you then add to the plaintext. So what does the round function look like? I've actually only drawn 1/4 of it here. So what it does is, this is an operation of 4 words, sorry. And you do this 4 times in parallel to update all 16 words. And in order to prevent a problem similar as in the llama cipher you saw in the exercises, if you would only separately update each of these 4-word blocks, you would have no interaction between them, no diffusion. So instead of always just doing this in the same order, what you do is you write your 16 words like the AES in a matrix, and in the even rounds, you apply the function to the columns, and in the odd rounds, you apply the same function row-wise. And this way you achieve some diffusion. And what the function now does is it's an ARX design, so it uses modular addition modulo 32, 2 to the 32, which is essentially the add instruction, and you lose the overflow in case it happens. Then you see here rotations, and you see XORs. And that's it. So it's a relatively simple ARX design, which tries to use only these simple CPU instructions in order to be very efficient. And in total, this construction is then repeated for 20 rounds. So 10 times like this and 10 times like this, always alternating between the two. And at the end, you get the key stream and XOR that to the message. Okay, that's it for today. So in a conclusion, what did we see today? We first talked a bit about constrained devices and why they need lightweight crypto, which metrics are particularly relevant, in particular area, energy, and in some cases latency. And we saw which operations are more suited for particular software or hardware platforms, and what some general designs look like. So in particular, we had a look at Present and ASCON at this point. In the last third, we looked at stream ciphers, which try to expand a short key into a long key stream, which is then XORed to the message. And we saw both LFSR-based constructions, where it's crucial to also add something nonlinear to it. And we saw some alternatives which also produce a key stream, but do not use these classical key stream operations inside. So in particular, we had a look at Cha-Cha, which looks a bit like counter mode. And if you use something like AES in counter mode, you also get a stream cipher. You don't get one that's particularly well suited for hardware because you're still running the AES, but it's an interesting construction nevertheless. Okay, that's it from my side for today. Are there still any questions from your side? If you are curious about the next exercise sheet, I will upload that either tonight or tomorrow morning. Okay, it doesn't really look like any questions are incoming, so I'll close the YouTube stream then. I'll stay a minute or so longer in the Teams chat, and otherwise, I wish you a nice weekend. Oh, there is a question. How secure are the stream ciphers we saw today? ASCON, Trivium, Cha-Cha 20 compared to AES? Trivium is definitely weaker than the AES for several reasons. First, it has a smaller key, only 80 bits. Second, the security margin is really, really slim. So it almost has to reach the full number of rounds, and it wouldn't be unexpected if it would soon reach the full number of rounds. So Trivium, less secure than AES, but not catastrophic. So it's not, it hasn't seen a strong break yet, unlike RC4 or other designs. Which is also one of the reasons that I showed it instead of older stuff like E0. Cha-Cha 20 is a relatively new design. It hasn't received that much external cryptanalysis, to be honest. So it might be possible to still find something there, but it's still relatively popular. So it's a design by DJB, who is very good in advertising his stuff on Twitter and stuff, or similar platforms. So you will encounter this quite often as a favorite cipher of people because they've heard about it on Twitter or so. So currently the security level looks very good. However, it's less well analyzed than the AES. So it looks as secure, but we aren't really sure whether it will still be the same in a few years' time, because few people have tried to break it. ASCON has a similar age. It has seen, I would say, more analysis than Cha-Cha 20. It is, however, not really used in any big production designs yet. But during the ongoing competition, of course, many people are looking at it. So we by now have a very good trust in its security. It also has a very good security margin, like the AES. In particular, something where ASCON would be more secure than the other ones is as soon as you take implementation attacks into account. So both something like misuse attacks and properties like power analysis or attacks are and similar. It's easier to defend ASCON against these things than AES or Cha-Cha. So if you do a straightforward implementation, this implementation of ASCON will be more secure than a straightforward implementation of AES, for example. However, in total, it can be said that everything you wrote in braces has received less analysis than the AES, so we're less sure of it yet. But the nominal security level of ASCON and Cha-Cha 20 is comparable to AES. Of course, there are always different variants of these ciphers, so all of these have larger key sizes and smaller key sizes available and so on, so this, of course, has to be taken into account. But right now, I would recommend all of these except Trivium as something that I believe to be secure. But if you want to convince somebody else that you are using secure crypto, then AES is the choice to go to. I hope this answered the question satisfactorily. So goodbye YouTube stream in the meantime. And